Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending on which part of the world you're joining in from. Today, we have another seminar focused on global Englishes, and our speaker for today is Professor Christopher J. Hall, and he is going to tell us something about the ontological definitions and clarifications on this particular paradigm for English language teaching. So, as always, very happy to have such an important scholar with us who is going to uh, give us some ideas on how we can best understand this paradigm, which continues to be quite difficult for some people to grasp, perhaps not only intellectually, but also pedagogically. How can all this be translated in pedagogical terms? So, Professor Hall, the floor is yours whenever you would like to begin.
Thank you,
Thank you again
Paolo.
for joining us.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Paolo, and everyone at DeliNet for inviting me. It's a delight to be here, and thanks everyone that's joined the meeting. Before I start, Paolo, can you tell me how to get back to my first slide? I've been pressing the back button.
Uh, on Try using your keyboard and the left arrow key.
That's what I'm
Either
doing.
the left, the
Yeah,
up arrow key is
and
the
the
up
upper,
arrow key.
neither of them seem to work. Well, uh, oh.
There you go.
For some reason it just started working. Okay, so here's
No worries.
the first
At
slide.
Between Zoom and PowerPoint, it's not a nice marriage.
Well, neither is it with Teams, but but we'll get through. So again, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you today about the work I've been doing on ontologies of English. So the things that Englishes are, or people believe Englishes are, and the connection with language ideologies. And the talk today is prompted in part by the reservations I see in MA students, MA TESOL students, teachers around the world, the reservations they have about this idea of ontologies of English, and especially in the light of the recent work on ontologies in applied linguistics, which leads, I'm going to suggest, to some conflict for teachers. Um, right, again, it's not. Okay. So an outline of the talk. I'll say a few words about what I mean by ideological and ontological clarity, first of all, and then I'll give some background. As Paolo said, these are not necessarily very easy to grasp issues, especially the ontologies part. So I'm not going to take for granted that people know the work on language ideologies and ontologies. So I'll give some background. And then I'll present what I see as the main problem, which is what I'm calling post-language applied linguistics, this shift away from language itself, or as I'll say, it's actually plural, language themselves, maybe we should say, and the ontological conflict that this can give rise to in English teachers. A possible resolution I'm going to propose is the field of usage-based linguistics, which I think helps us to reach ontological clarity that therefore can underpin ideological clarity for teachers. And I'll conclude with some ideas about what teachers can do. So starting with this idea of ideological clarity, I came across this first in the work of Alfaro and Bartolome, work on bilingual education. And they defined ideological clarity as the ongoing process that requires individuals to compare and contrast their explanations of the existing social order with those propagated by the dominant society. The expectation is that by consciously juxtaposing ideologies, teachers will understand if, when, and how their belief systems uncritically reflect those of the dominant society and support unfair and inequitable conditions. So the idea is to raise awareness of differences in ideological belief, especially where there are asymmetries of power that have not been acknowledged. So what's the connection between ideology and ontology? Well, it became clear to me when I came across an article from the 1970s by a philosopher um, called R.A. Sharp, Robert Augustus Sharp, wonderful philosopher name there. And he spells out how the two are connected. So in that paper, he says, any comprehensive worldview constitutes an ideology. Such a worldview, therefore an ideology, will contain both an ontology and a set of values. So ideologies, in this sense, contain ontologies. Um, there are beliefs about what things are, values are attributed to those things, and that is what constitutes an ideological system. So, a few words about language ideologies, then, just as background. Um, I think about language ideologies in two kind of groups. One which is language regulation, and the other I call is linguistic indexicality. So let me just tell you what I mean by those. With language regulation, you have ideological beliefs which lead to changes in language forms and uses, management of language forms and uses. Whereas linguistic indexicality is the other way around. This is where language forms and uses are encountered, and they index um, social meanings which lead to the activation and reinforcement of ideological beliefs. So let me give you some examples of that. So in language regulation, um, it might start, this is the main, in fact, the main language ideology that I see as the root of all language ideologies. The ideology is a non-linguistic ideology, one of unified national identity. Okay, and this leads to the regulation of language so that it reflects and embodies that unified national identity. So you get a unified national language. Okay, so this is a, process of language regulation that has its roots in the foundation of nation states from the Renaissance, but especially in the 18th century and consolidated in the 19th century. This then leads to process of linguistic indexicality. So if you have a unified national language, not everyone has access to that unified national language. So this is where you start to see asymmetries of power. And when you get people languaging, using language that doesn't uh, match the unified national language, those groups then are tend to be minoritized. So people encounter languaging that is not part of the unified national language, the codified unified national language, and that leads to ideological responses, elitism and racism on the part of the privileged groups towards those who are not using the language of the nation, the correct form of it. So concretely, the ideologies associated with these two processes are, first of all, standard language ideology, codification, and that subordinate, that sub ideology of correctness that comes along with the existence of a standard form of the language. And you'll notice already the relevance of this for ELT. Um, Alongside standard language ideology, the ideology of one nation, one language. Um, you can't, not only does there need to be a standard form of the language of the nation, but there needs to be just one language rather than other languages. And therefore, associated with this is an ideology of monolingualism, yeah, that it's normal for individuals and nations to be monolingual. The ones that are more relevant, perhaps, for linguistic index for us are those of linguistic indexicality, and broadly, the idea of native speakerism. This idea that um, L2 users are not as legitimate as L1 users. And this is a fundamental ideology that is embedded in ELT. Um, it brings with it neo-colonial ideas of ownership of English and racism too. So here, that's just a brief overview of the ideologies of language that I think are pertinent for ELT. So let's now move to ontologies. This is the tougher one, the harder one to grasp. I still struggle with it. Um, my students do, my colleagues do. Um, very few of us have got a philosophical background, so it can be quite taxing on the brain, but I'll try to make it as easy as possible. So ontology is, um, as a philosophical discipline, the study of what there is, or at least what we believe there is. So there's an epistemological aspect to it as well. Ontologists then study the nature of entities, yeah, how they're categorized and the relations between them. And entities is everything. Yeah, it's physical objects, books, tables, non-physical objects, money, honesty, as well as processes, walking, laughing, whatever, and events, birthday parties, coronations, whatever. Yeah. Um, and individuals have ontological commitments. They have beliefs about what there is, yeah, and what it's like. So about what English is and what English is like, the nature of English. And their commitments, their beliefs, their ontological beliefs are mostly implicit. So even for linguists and language teachers, uh, they haven't necessarily been explicit. And this is one of the reasons I think this work is important. They haven't necessarily contemplated, reflected on the nature of English or language. And they can be inconsistent within individuals and between contexts of use. And for all ontology, and especially for ontologies of language, language itself is a problem because words don't map one-to-one onto entities. And this is despite the very, very strong tendency we have to essentialize, to believe that if there is a word for something, then there is a single concept that that word um, is labeling. Yeah, which is really the wrong way round. What we should be doing is thinking about what are the things that we actually call language, rather than asking what is language. You know, so we'll be trying to take that approach here. So the word language corresponds to several different entities, ontological categories. Here are some examples of language use lifted from random, basically from the internet. The origins of language are a mystery. So what kind of thing is language there? Well, I would suggest it's the human capacity that we all share. Whereas in this one, when Dennis had his stroke, it affected his language only. We're talking about something that is actually represented in neural tissue that can get damaged by a stroke. Yeah, so language is that also. Whereas in this one, her language was slow and hard to understand. Language is something that is extended in time, right? It can be slow, it can be fast. So it's a physical manifestation. It's not in the head, it's out there. And the fourth example, mostly the language was soothing and conciliatory. Well, language there is something in the social domain. Yes, it's a process, a practice that has an effect on people. So language is lots of different things. Applied linguistics has become interested in language ontology over the last 15, 20 years. Um, and the mainstream views on language ontology have been very much inspired by ontological turns in other disciplines, and particularly in science and technology studies. The work of Bruno Latour and Karen Barad have been particularly influential. This thinking, post-humanist, new materialist thinking, um, is very difficult to grasp, but I want to try to give you a flavor of it here. Post-humanists are quite radical in what they're saying. They reject the existence of mental representations, linguistic representations of separately existing entities in favor of discursive practices, or what are called assemblages, which are basically events, happenings rather than things, in which humans and non-humans are entangled inextricably. It's impossible to isolate particular entities within these interactions. So Barad, for example, says, a performative understanding of discursive practices challenges the representationalist belief in the power of words to represent pre-existing things. So in a sense, then, you can see language being set aside in favor of social practice. Language is seen as structure, and it's rejected by this strand of philosophy. But this is the strand of philosophy that's been adopted by prominent applied linguists. This dichotomy between representation, which includes language, and practice has been embraced. And this is what I've been calling a post-language shift in the discipline of applied linguistics, away from looking at language as system, particularly associated with Alistair Pennycook and Suresh Kanagaraja, but many other um, thinkers and scholars too. So just some quotes from Pennycook and Kanagaraja. Um, from 2010, the notion of language as a system is challenged in favor of a view of language as doing. Yeah, so the two are being pitted against each other. Neither system nor competence nor structure sit comfortably with a practice-oriented focus. That was from Pennycook. From Kanagaraja, on language as something distinct, as something cognitive representation. The individual, or her or his mind, is not the repository of meanings, knowledge, or competence. Instead, they emerge in social, material, and semiotic networks. And finally, English is an assemblage of diverse semiotic resources it has come into contact with. And parenthetically, I use the inclusive term semiotic resources as linguistic resources are only one of many signs people use to communicate. So I hope you can see that for English language teachers, the it's difficult to get one's head around the idea of language as social practice um, being an alternative to language as system, because language as system is very much entrenched in ELT and language teachers' minds. Um, so this is where I'm seeing the ontological conflict starting to arise. Um, Instead, I have identified a different dichotomy, which I think is more helpful and more accessible. So my approach is a relativized approach, which acknowledges that there are many different things called language and called English at the same time. We don't need to choose between them. They coexist, but they'll be separately invoked or jointly invoked according to what we're doing, what we're interested in, what our purpose is. So the dichotomy I'm proposing is that there is a set of sociocognitive phenomena that we can call language, we can call English, and that is very different from the ideological construction that we can call English. So this is a different dichotomy, and I'm arguing a more helpful one. So according to this idea that language is a set of sociocognitive phenomena, English then is composed of multiple things, resources, processes, products, uncontained by defined borders, formally and functionally diverse, and constantly being restructured through usage. And we can oppose that to the common belief, which I think also underpins a lot of ELT, independently of um, um, elf-informed teaching or GELT, that English exists by virtue of the original existence of a group of people perceiving themselves as a nation, the English, and those who now trace a cultural lineage with this group. So, what we've got then is a fundamental distinction between what I call in my ontological analysis L language and N language. And I'm borrowing this kind of terminology from Chomsky, of all people. I think that Chomsky was wrong about lots of things, but he was right to a certain extent about um, the way that he conceptualized different views of what language is. So L English is, as I said, a set of entities. They are social, but they're also cognitive. They're mental as well as social. They are resources, they're processes, they're products. They all together realize our evolved capacity to use um, lexicogrammatical symbol combinations. So this is the linguistic view of English. And that's opposed to N English. And serendipitously, um, all its attributes start with the letter N, which is marvelous, I think. It's a named social resource, um, an idealized abstraction from L English. Yeah, so it was co-opted from L English, um, as I said, starting in the Renaissance, but especially in the 18th century. It originally indexed nationhood through that ideological process, and it's now understood in terms of fixed native-owned norms. Yeah, not conventions, but regulative norms. Um, so we've got this fundamental distinction. We can see it when we look at the way people talk about English. So here's some more random examples. As a consequence of her dementia, the patient lost her English language, right? So something in the brain is being damaged here. What's happening is happening independently of there being something that we call English, right? It's independent of there being something that we think about or that we name as English. It's going to happen in any case. Dutch children grow up hearing English in popular culture from a very early age, right? So English here is something that can be heard. It's a physical manifestation. It's not inside the head. It's out there. Both things are called English. And here's one from ELF studies. ELF is a way of being and doing English. So ELF is a process. Yeah, ELF is, I believe Sifakis says ELF is a way. Yeah, ELF is something that is done. And here's one that reflects the N English conceptualization. This is, some people will recognize this from Boris Johnson. This is a country that happens to speak English. Yeah, so the personification of the country speaking English, it's part of, that's the origin of this idea of English as N English. Okay, so what I said at the beginning was then you have ontological categories, people's commitments to what exists, and then ideologies come about through the attribution of values to those entities. So I want to just give a couple of examples of how this happens with English and those two different kind of families of what English is, L English and N English. The first example is from legislation in the UK for that public service workers, so public service workers who interact with members of the public, there is a statutory duty that they are fluent in English. Okay, so ostensibly the motivation for this legislation was from L English. The legislation states a person speaks fluent English if the person has a command of spoken English which is sufficient to enable the effective performance of the person's role. That sounds fine, doesn't it? It's about effective communication. That's what L English evolved L language evolved in the species for. But if you look at the motivation for this legislation, you see a different picture emerging. It's actually a commitment to N English, to value being associated with sociopolitical value being associated with English. So, for example, the context of this legislation was proposed in the British values section of the Tory manifesto, the Conservative manifesto, and it was made law as part of the Immigration Act. So, in fact, the conceptualization of English here is part of anti-immigrant discourse. And you see it in the code of practice, which is for employers, giving them guidance about how they should enact this legislation. I was consulted on this by the Cabinet Office and um, quite plainly told them that fluency was not best understood in terms of accuracy and correctness, but in terms of communication. My advice was completely ignored. And the code of practice refers to accuracy of English, correctness, which is an N English um, notion. This kind of thinking, this invocation of N English is happening in policy today. I'm sure you've all seen the executive orders that Trump has been issuing, and one a few months ago was that English is the declared the official language of the USA. Again, there is an L English, ostensible N English motivation. It's going to ensure consistency in government operations. It's going to streamline communication. But the reality, the underlying reality is different, and it's actually acknowledged there in the executive order. It, in fact, is intended to promote unity, cultivate a shared American culture, and reinforce shared national values. So you can see there the attribution of value to L English categories, resulting in this notion of N English. So we can group then two different sets of what I call ideo-ontological postures, which are sets of ideological, ontological beliefs and attitudes that people hold. And we can contrast monolithic English with pluralithic English, as this word pluralithic originally coined by Alistair Pennycook. So we can contrast fixed named lexicogrammatical systems, the monolithic thinking, with variable resources which emerge and change with usage. The idea that there is a fixed set of legitimate users of English and uses of English, with the idea that English is something that is distributed across all users and uses. The idea that English is associated with monolinguals, contrasted with the idea that English is something that gets combined with and overlaps with other language resources and processes. Something that's owned by native speakers or something that's appropriable by anyone to any extent. Appropriable, that's a nice word that I think I might have invented, I'm not sure. Monolithic English thinking then is elitist and hegemonic. Pluralithic thinking about English is egalitarian and decolonizing. So, okay, taking stock. I think hopefully I'm okay with time. Okay, good. We've got these two ways of thinking about English and about language. One which is monolithic with entities that are fixed, that underpin an ideology which is quite harmful. Contrast that with pluralithic thinking. So according to the argument that I'm trying to articulate here, this relativized idea, it connects up these positions, these postures connect up with that original dichotomy in the following way. Language as a system, so that idea of language as a system is shared by both the monolithic and the pluralithic postures. Yeah, N language is a system, but it's a regulative system. L language, I'm wanting to argue, is also systematic, but in a different way, as we'll see. Language as practice and language as system are both part of L language. This is studied by general linguistics. Okay, and we could talk about that later if you want. There's a lot of contamination from N language into linguistic views of language. But the general idea of linguistics is to study both the system and the practice in the broad view of general linguistics. Applied linguistics, as I've been arguing, is the dominant position at the moment is that language is best seen as social practice. Unfortunately, much ELT is still based on this idea of native norms and targets as represented in textbooks and tests. Contrast that with the post-language position. And you can see the problem here for me is that language as practice is seen as uniquely the ontological category that aligns with pluralistic thinking. Language as system is being rejected because it's associated with monolithic thinking only. So applied linguists in this way of thinking are very critical of linguistics and of mainstream ELT. Applied linguistics is focusing these days very much on language as practice. And I think that this leads to ontological conflict for language teachers. On the one hand, they're hearing in MA programs, for example, and in talks about the latest thinking in applied linguistics, where language is seen as undifferentiated from other semiotic systems and is part of social practice. And the idea of language as being something systematic or something cognitive is rejected. On the other hand, though, there are very, very entrenched ontologies of English shared by linguistics, by many ELT practitioners, and by lay people, that languages do exist and they are systems of grammatical conventions. Teachers need to deal with grammar in classrooms. So specifically, the problem is how do we acknowledge the existence of grammar as part of the semiotic resources underpinning Englishing practices, while at the same time resisting the social injustices caused by the N-English notion of monolithic grammar. So it's trying to tease apart these issues. I think the answer lies in looking at language as a resource or a repertoire. And this notion of language is actually consistently invoked by applied linguists who are post-language applied linguists. So Pennycook, for example, says repertoires are the accumulated resources of individual trajectories, the accumulation of linguistic or more broadly semiotic resources at a speaker's disposal. So in effect, a person's linguistic repertoire is what Chomsky called I language, something internal. Their repertoire is something they carry around with them and use and deploy in events, in performance events. So I don't mean I language in the technical Chomskyan sense, but just in the sense of something internal and individual that individuals carry around with them. Translanguaging has picked up on this idea. So this is a way forward for me. Translanguaging, in the words of, for example, Otegi, Garcia, and Reed, it refers to using one's idiolect. Yeah, again, I language. That is one's linguistic repertoire, identifying the two, without regard for socially and politically defined language labels or boundaries, right? So challenging that N language view. An idiolect is for us a person's own unique personal language. The person's mental grammar that emerges interaction with other speakers and enables the person's use of language. So you can see, hopefully, there's a connection here from that idea of repertoire in post-language applied linguistics, translanguaging, this strand of translanguaging, recognizing idiolect there, but it's not theorized. There are no um, grammatical descriptions, for example, from those perspectives. Usage-based linguistics, however, does theorize this idea of grammar. So I'm going to move now to usage-based linguistics as a possible resolution of this ontological conflict. And it's a resolution because it brings the two together. It conceptualizes grammar as a cognitive resource, but one that emerges from social practice. It conceives of language as a dynamic network in which different aspects of a language user's linguistic knowledge are constantly restructured, reorganized under continuous pressure of performance. So again, we're seeing that central idea of performance, of practice. John Bybee um, uh, explains how the general capabilities of the human brain, so not something specifically linguistic, as Chomsky argued, work on language events, categorizing and entering into memory their actual experiences of language as doing. And the result is a cognitive representation that we can call grammar, tied to the specific experiences that a speaker has with language. So this is very different from the top-down monolithic view. And it recasts the idea of what language rules are, which teachers are very interested in. According to Nick Ellis, rules of language are structural regularities that emerge from learners' lifetime analysis of the distributional characteristics of the language input. So back to ontology. How does this fit in with this idea of there being different things called English? Well, in my analysis, there are three different domains of reality: a cognitive domain, a social domain, and an expressive domain. I-English is then something that exists in the cognitive domain. Englishing, the actual practice of using those I-English resources, is something that happens in the social domain, and it leaves products, actual speech, sentences, utterances in the expressive domain. How does this connect with usage-based linguistics? Well, this is an ontology that can underpin usage-based linguistics. The idea is that I-English is used in usage events, Englishing. It results in speech as captured by a corpus, and people's experience of that allows them to construct the language if they're learning, or reconstruct the language through the lifetime. So it's a constant cycle with the social domain as the central domain. Englishing is what it's all about, but Englishing can't happen with those resources. Okay. So most of usage-based linguistics work has been on first language acquisition. This is how children acquire their language, through usage. But there's a lot of work on second language acquisition as well, using usage-based linguistics. And we know now that alongside what teachers do and what students do in classrooms with textbooks, learning vocabulary, learning grammar rules, learners automatically develop language resources, their own I language, on the basis of meaningful input in usage events. And there's accumulating evidence for this in the research literature. Much of this then will happen beyond the classroom. And so it will be pluralithic. It won't be this monolithic set of N English norms that are there in the textbooks and tested on the tests. It will be different and variable. It will be pluralithic. For English, this is happening ever more extensively as learners experience L2 English in particularly ELF contexts. because of global mobility, but especially now online communication, social media, multiplayer gaming, fan fiction, all sorts of different modes of online activity where people are coming into contact with Englishes that are not those of the textbook. Increasingly, this is being recognized by language teachers. It's being incorporated, this inevitable encounter with English is being incorporated into language teaching contexts. There's renewed interest in that um, these days. One example is bridging activities, which are intended to bridge the class, what's happening inside the classroom with what's happening outside of the classroom. And in these activities, realia, so uses of English outside of the classroom are brought into the classroom, and there they represent a counterweight, in Thorne and Reinhardt's words, to the prescriptivist versions of grammar, style, and vocabulary in foreign language texts that typically are not based upon actual language use. So, UBL, usage-based linguistics, I argue, provides a way for teachers to conceptualize grammar not in those N-language monolithic terms, but as I-language systems and as languaging practices, which doesn't need then that commitment to monolithic norms. Yeah, it's a way of thinking about grammar, and language as system, which doesn't necessitate those harmful ideological beliefs about what English is. So teachers can develop a pluralistic ideo-ontological posture while both understanding English as a languaging practice, but also as an I-language system. Okay, some conclusions. So just as Alfaro and Bartolome call for bilingual educators to develop their ideological clarity in parallel with their pedagogical expertise, I advocate then that teachers can develop ontological clarity too, to help them to challenge that inherent native speakerism in ELT. The ontological clarity can be attained through an understanding of that difference between language, English as linguistic product, process, resource, and language as ideological construct. In this sense, then, I see ELT as facilitating learners' development of their own I-Englishes, their own resources and languaging skills for the variable social practices they will participate in, while at the same time making them aware of the nature of Englishes as both ontological and ideological categories in the world. I like this quote from Robert de Capua. It's not the role of ESL teachers to make students become more native-like in their behaviors. Rather, their role is to help students become aware of their own and the new behaviors, along with the underlying norms, beliefs, and values, and the role of all of these in cross-cultural communication or miscommunication. Communication is the goal. So, GELT is a way of doing this. Global English is for language teaching. That wonderful book by Rose and Galloway from a few years ago is pluralistically oriented. And actually, Rose and Galloway call for ontological reconsideration of what language is in that text. A way to explore these ideas further for teachers is to use the online course that I developed with my colleague Rachel Wichaksono, which explores English ontology and ontologies of English, and helps teachers to think through some of the issues I've been talking about today. It's now in its third edition. It's free. It's all open source material. So I do encourage you to sign up for that if you're interested. I think I've got time. Do I, Paolo, to? Yeah, last slide. Just some topics to try to make this a bit more concrete at the end that can be included, which I think can develop this kind of ideo-ontological thinking, is first to think again about correctness, um, which pervades ELT practice, doesn't it? This idea of accuracy being one of the three dimensions that we're trying to promote in learners, and to critically reconsider it in terms of appropriateness. There are problems with appropriateness, but I think if we can talk to each other, teachers, and to our students, but not about language being incorrect or inaccurate, but not necessarily being appropriate for the particular languaging um, practices that we're currently engaged in. Another very profitable area to look at is this idea of Englishes, to talk to students about this idea of Englishes and personal Englishes, and to try to understand, to raise awareness of um, what Cohn calls the my English condition, which therefore allows learners to also explore whether, in fact, they do want to orient towards native speaker norms. That may be what they want to do. And that is something that we need to also acknowledge and think about. But it needs to be surfaced, this idea of that there are different Englishes that people can acquire. And then a very concrete one, this idea of what rules of English mean, right? So thinking ontologically about what rules of English are. So in one part of the Changing Englishes course, we suggest an analogy between two different readings of the word rule. One is rule as regulation. Yeah, so it's against the rules to walk on the grass. And contrast that with rule as regularity, which is the usage-based idea. As a rule, lavender cotton flowers die by the end of the summer, right? Notice there's one there that hasn't. Yeah, that's rules as regularities. So I think if teachers think in that way about grammatical rules, um, we will be able to contextualize what rules are in a way which is more pluralistic than monolithic. There are more ideas and strategies in some of our papers. I've given some references there. Thank you very much for listening. Here are the references.
Thank you so much, Professor Hall. That's yeah, absolutely wonderful. And sorry, I had forgotten about that you had contributed to the Changing English's website. Otherwise, I would have mentioned that at the beginning. I actually referred to that in my dissertation. But yeah, absolutely wonderful presentation. And I do have some questions, but before that, I want to ask the people who are attending if they have any questions. Again, if you do not want your voice to be recorded, you can just type in the chat. The chat is not recorded, so you can just do that. Um,
Paulo, I have a question for Professor Hall. Um, the idea of ontological and ideological conflict, it's very helpful for teacher education to understand the way that they learn English and also the way that they prepare to teach English it's very useful. And normally when I work with teachers, they often bring these ontological and ideological conflict to teacher education programs. And oftentimes these ideology is very entrenched and it takes time to change. Uh, in your last slide, you mentioned preparing teachers to be critical consciousness, right? In terms of implementing those rules. And it seems like in your course, it's you use very strategies, right? In changing English course to help teachers realize by themselves, right? Can you share with us more whether which one do you think should be the starting point in doing like in preparing teachers to have ideological clarity and in your anticipation, how long should it take to prepare teachers with critical consciousness?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you share with us more a little bit about those teacher preparation? Yeah.
Yes, it's extraordinarily difficult. Thank you for the question, because that is, I think, the nub, isn't it? That's the real problem. How deeply entrenched these beliefs are. Um, and I don't think there's a silver bullet here. There isn't a particular um, strategy that's going to work for all students. Interestingly, teachers come with different levels of monolithic thinking or pluralistic thinking. So what we do on the course is actually start with a questionnaire, so people can self-assess their kind of their current state of thinking about what English is and what Englishes are, and on that basis they can decide, that you could decide perhaps as a teacher trainer what is the most appropriate way to introduce some of these ideas. Um, there are many different ways that you can do this. One is through the strategy that I've used in part on this in this presentation, is to actually look at the ways that people talk about English and about Englishes, right? So it comes from um, the way people talk about English, and they start to see, yeah, actually there are these different things, right? That we use the word English to label. That's one way to do it. Um, at a very basic level. If it looks like teachers are more accepting of some of the ideas, another way that we have trialed is near peer role models. Um, and we published a paper in TESOL Quarterly actually using that strategy. So we video recorded teachers who have embraced this pluralistic thinking, and they talk about what they do in their classrooms. And what you try to do is not just any old role model. So, not me, an old white-haired guy, but someone who we did it with teachers in Germany and teachers in China. So they were German and Chinese teachers talking roughly the same age as the teacher trainees, so younger, um, talking about pluralistic thinking. And we saw a change. We were able to measure changes in belief from before and after seeing those role models. So that's one idea.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Professor Hall, thanks a lot. Do you think that the future grammars of English will become more context bound and restructured? They would become deeper in meaning and more expressive. At the same time, would grammar become simplified from the perspective of the old prescriptive native speaker rules of the language?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Um, it's I think the issue is that we've got to stop talking about English grammar and talk about grammars. So the options that you give there, I think they're all going to happen because grammars are in human minds. Grammars are sets of regularities, sorry, that uh, emerge from people's usage. Um, and that's the notion of grammar that I'm trying to push here, that teachers need to think about. So some learners will be interested in acquiring the grammars of native speakers, for example. And of course, there are many, many different grammars in native speakers also. So some learners may be interested in acquiring the grammars that allow you to do academic writing, for example, whereas other learners might be interested or need to acquire much simpler grammars that underpin much more, let's say, transactional oral interactions. Um, so yeah, Englishes are can grammars of English can vary from very, very, very complex grammars to very, very simple systems, but they're all grammar. I don't know whether that answers the question.
I
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah, Professor. Yeah, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, and I completely agree with you that, you know, basically as we process the language, we're constantly reinventing new rules and at the same time breaking old rules. And actually, I'm arguing that grammar is at the nexus of people's linguistic repertoire and and the reality in which they live. So in many ways, grammar is localized and it's context bound and it's experiential. Basically, it's how you construct the social reality around you. And actually, I'm doing an article and I'm trying to prove that basically Thai speakers of English uh, express their identity through new grammatical forms, which are not the old prescriptive forms of the language. And the same happens to me as a non-native speaker. For example, my home language is Bulgarian, and very often I still make the mistake, or maybe it's not a mistake, by uh, ascribing gender to nouns,
Mm,
because in my mind, nouns have symbolic meaning and they basically create this mental picture.
mm,
And I'm by doing so, I'm ascribing new grammatical rules.
mm,
But I think as this happens, as we constantly reinvent new rules, we are actually going to slowly move away from those old prescriptive irregularities of English. Like very often students ask me, okay, why do we have those, for example, indefinite articles like a or an? And these are things that we cannot always explain
yeah.
using that old grammatical approach. And this is where we have to rely again on those ontological inquiries as to how the language changes and modifies
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah, I absolutely agree 100% with everything that you're saying. I'm not sure, though, that in English, right, these prescriptive rules are going to disappear because of just the strength of the invested interests from the big publishers, the testing machines out there, uh, governments. Um, it is we have a formidable opponent, I think, out there, which are still pushing the idea of native speaker uh, standard English norms. So it's an uphill struggle.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the question, Valentin. Really, really appreciate it. We have another question in the chat. A student asked me a question yesterday about the varieties of English. He said, in Ghana, we have agreed to use British English. So is it necessary to learn about other varieties as well?
Um, yeah, interesting question. Yeah, I wonder who uh, we is there. We have agreed to use British English, and I wonder what British English means there too. So I would, I would question that. I think there isn't sort of national consensus about what kind of English should be used, and in any case, English. Remember, in the L language view of English, English is going to just happen in any case in Ghana in pluralistic ways in different contexts. So, okay, there could be official policy about the way you're supposed to use English, um, but it's not going to happen. right? English will happen. L English is going to happen independently of whatever anyone says about N English. Thank you, though, for the question
All
or the
right.
comment.
Thank you, Professor Hall. Um, the, if you have just a little bit more time, I do have one question
Sure.
because during the presentation, you said that if somebody wanted to know more about it, you would be talking about it. And that, because at a certain point, you briefly mentioned the contamination of this ideology that you call the N language into linguistics, because quite rightly you focused the talk on, the ELT industry, on the political system, because those are very strong. But could you say a few words about what you meant there about this ideology trickling into
Yeah.
the
Uh,
scholarly discipline? Yeah.
yeah. Thanks, Paolo, for giving me that opportunity. Yeah, it's my background is in linguistics, general linguistics, but I've been doing applied linguistics for a long, long time. But it's been becoming increasingly clear to me how much of general linguistics is at least in danger of talking about N English or N language when they say they're talking about or interested in L English or L language. So a clear case that I've always been aware of is Chomsky, who uses grammaticality judgments as his main source of evidence for generativist theory, and those grammaticality judgments are clearly based on N English because an N language they are filtered through um, people's conscious judgments about what is grammatical or not, and people have been educated into N language. So generativism very definitely contaminated in that sense. But also, variationist sociolinguistics, Lebovian sociolinguistics, because there's still that abstraction away from individual grammar and individual language to, for example, the community, the speech community, or the community of English speakers, which Lebov actually refers to. Um, so there's a danger there of abstracting away from what grammar really is ontologically, which is something that exists in people's brains, um, to a system which then is hard to distinguish from that nationally codified system. So that's what I mean by that sort of cross-contamination. You also see it in SLA studies. So even the usage-based linguistics that I talked about, which has been used in SLA, unfortunately, underpinning that work is still the idea that what's being acquired should be native speaker norms. Yeah, so it's still you see if they're looking at, for example, how a particular grammatical construction is developed by second language learners, they're always using they're judging success in that acquisition according to native speaker norms, rather than following um, different trajectories towards something that might be non-native, as the previous question, as Valentin mentioned, right? That's SLA is not studying that. So again, that's what I mean by N language contamination.
No, no, thank you for saying this, Professor Hall, because indeed, I I don't know if it was just my own personal bias or I just couldn't understand the things that I was reading, but I did get this perspective, even when it wasn't explicitly, let's say, oriented towards native speakerism, especially when things like culture were started to be discussed together with language. I kind of saw this ideology, maybe not obvious, but coming in between the lines of a lot of the things that I was reading. But
Hmm.
again, perhaps that was just my own prejudice. But thank you for giving your view on this. So actually, we have a couple of questions. I don't know if you have time to address them. I can.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your lecture. Back to ELT. Do you think analyzing students' needs is required for teachers to achieve a usage-based teaching? And what parts need to be included? Thank you.
Um, yeah, needs analysis, yeah, is obviously important because yeah, if the your approach to language is usage based, then it is all about the way that learners will use the language. So in many cases, when it's clear or when it can become clear what learners need to use the language for, um, then that will be very, very useful for teachers so that they can design appropriate content and appropriate activities. Um, so if you can do it, if it's doable, then very much so, needs analysis is important. Um, but clearly, not all teachers and not all contexts are going to allow for that, right? So there is still a lot of um, top-down uh, direction for teachers to teach from certain content, from certain textbooks, independently of what learners might then go on to need English for. And as we all know, in many cases, English is not seen as something that will be used. It is an ideological passport to power or jobs or whatever in any case. Rather than being something that will be actually used. So again, it depends on, I think, local context, but even in those top-down processes, I would hope that teachers could be subversive in a way in the classroom and try to understand, so talk about English in the classroom, which I don't think happens enough. We teach English, but we don't necessarily talk about it, that raising of awareness about what English is and what English is for. So in that sense, a needs analysis um, could operate where you actually talk to your students about their interest in English and what they would need it for. I hope that goes some way towards answering that very good question.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Professor Hall. I think that I understood what you meant, so hopefully that was satisfactory. One very last question, if you have the time. Why do we use the pronoun we in different contexts, and how does it shape the way we understand inclusion or collective identity in language?
Yes, a very good question. Another very good question. These are excellent questions. Um, yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Um, we, there I am using it myself. Um, we get away with a lot of unreflexive thinking, don't we, by saying we, um, and especially when we're talking about uh, language and ownership, right? So you see, just bringing this to the specific case of English and English teachers, you see lots and lots of uh, online guides, for example, textbooks, where you see sentences like, "In English, we say this, we do not say that." Um, and yeah, implicit there is that idea of ownership, pro being proprietors of the language, um, the language being not open to others to negotiate, but something that we have expertise in. So yeah, it is. I'm not answering your question, I realize, because I don't think I have the expertise to do so. But it's something that discourse and analysts will certainly have already looked at. Um, but yeah, that it's an interesting thing to look out for. It should be seen as a flag every time someone says we. Who are they actually um, who are they actually talking about? not sure that that was an adequate answer to that question, but best I can come up
No, but
with.
no, but I think it's a it's an ongoing question. I think it will take a long time to answer this one, and uh, I'm trying my best with doing something somewhat related to identity in a project I'm working on right now. But yeah, that was all the questions we had for today. Thank you again, Professor Hall. I will stop the recording now. Thank you, everybody who